Welcome, everybody. My name is James Goodwin. I'm the Policy Director at the Center for Progressive Reform, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this very important and timely webinar. So over the last 100+ days, we watched the Trump administration slowly dismantle the regulatory system before our eyes, eliminate public participation various ways, turn over key aspects of its implementation to his close advisors like Elon Musk. And we've been playing a lot of defense during these days. But now it's time to think about how we go back on offense and start reclaiming our regulatory system. And that's what today's webinar is really about, is leveraging the tools that exist for reclaiming the regulatory system so that it works for us again and not for well-heeled elites. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Weintraub, Executive Director of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, for a few introductory remarks, and then I will introduce our panelists and go over a few housekeeping items. Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much, James. Good morning, everybody. So glad to be here. As James said, I am Rachel Weintraub, Executive Director of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. We are so appreciative to partner with the Center for Progressive Reform in hosting this webinar on building a people's regulatory agenda through rulemaking petitions. CSS is a coalition of over 200 organizations united in a belief that an effective regulatory system is essential to protecting the public interest. CSS is co-chaired by Public Citizen and Consumer Federation of America, and our executive committee includes AFL-CIO, the Center for Progressive Reform, the Economic Policy Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Regulations keep our food, air, and water clean and safe, our workplaces and household products safe, and set a level playing field so we all get a fair opportunity. CSS is committed to offering a sustained response to the various attacks on public protections while promoting ways to strengthen public protections and encourage sound enforcement. Powerful moneyed interests are working with sympathetic politicians and judges to roll back public protections, tie the hands of federal agencies, and cut funding and staff, impacting enforcement of important rules that are already in place and thwarting the development of future critically important rules. These attacks target not only our nation's landmark regulatory safeguards, but the role of government as a protector of our health, safety, environment, workplaces, and markets. I'm so grateful to the brilliant team at CPR and the panelists for their interest in discussing the importance of filing petitions and how filing these petitions is an important, proactive, pro-regulatory response to the attacks on our system of safeguards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. So start off with a few housekeeping items. If you get thrown off, here's a number you can call to join us if Zoom lets you down, as it's been known to do. All of you participants are muted, so sing in the background if you want. We won't hear it. And if you have questions during the presentation, the best way to submit those is by typing them into the Q&A box, where we'll be able to see them. Feel free to add them whenever they occur to you, and we'll try to get to them whenever it makes sense during the webinar. This is being recorded, so you will have access to this later, so you can rehear and revisit all the brilliant things again and share it with your friends. And there may be members of the press on today, just something to be aware of, I guess. So those are the housekeeping rules. Now let's turn it over to introducing our panelists. I gotta tell you, folks, we are in really terrific hands for this discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Sharon Block. She's a professor of practice and the executive director for the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School. Sharon previously served as the acting administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, during the Biden administration, and she is currently a board member and member scholar at the Center for Progressive Reform. Next, we have Daniel Walters. He is an associate professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law, and he is also a member scholar at the center. And last, we have Sydney Shapiro, who holds the Fletcher Chair in Administrative Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. He is currently the board chair for the center and a member scholar as well. So the way the run of show is going to work is we're going to go through some questions with the panelists, and then we'll turn things over to your folks for your questions and answers. All right. So to kick things off, Sharon, in your role as acting administrator of OIRA, one of your key responsibilities was helping the Biden administration assemble its semi-annual regulatory agenda. So how would you explain what the regulatory agenda is and why it's so important to people who don't know what that is?
Great, and thanks for including me in today's webinar. I love the regulatory agenda. Such a reg nerd. I look forward to it, or at least previously in my career, I always looked forward to Reg Agenda Day. So the Reg Agenda is really a remarkable document because it can give the public just an incredibly expansive view of the actions, the executive actions that the administration plans to take on their behalf in their name across the government over like usually a 12 to 18 month timeline. And so you can just look, as a member of the public, you can just look, are you interested in what the Department of Labor is going to do to protect your right to fair wages? You know, what is the EPA going to do to protect the quality of the water that you drink? And you can see what those actions are going to be coming up. And so if you want to engage with the government that's taking these actions on your behalf, it's a roadmap to be able to do that. So for the public, I think it's, although not the easiest document to access, if you can find your way through it, and now that it's online and searchable, it's become much easier. But it's also, I first fell in love with the Reg Agenda when I worked for Senator Kennedy, and every 6 months when that Reg Agenda came out, all the different parts of the Help Committee, we had to dig into our section. We had to look what had changed from the previous Reg Agenda, what was coming up. And we would use that first to inform the senator, but also to plan our oversight activities, to plan where did we want to use our resources to weigh in with comments. Where did we need to be getting on the ground to sort of understand a problem that the administration was planning to address so that we would be better informed, so that we could assess, you know, what action the administration was taking. So that was my first experience with what an incredibly powerful tool the Reg Agenda can be for holding the government accountable.
Thank you. And yeah, so if you see, there's a link there to see the an example of the Reg Agenda. It's a little hard to navigate, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a little more intuitive. And there's also really interesting search tools you can use to find things and make comparisons. So if you find yourselves with a few free moments, kick around with that. Under your leadership at OIRA, you introduced, or the Biden administration carried out a pretty broad initiative called Modernizing Regulatory Review. And one of the components of that was to reform how the regulatory agenda was assembled to make, as part of a broader effort to make the regulatory system more democratic. Can you describe those reforms and why they were so important?
Sure. And to be clear, this was work, I think the specific guidance on the Reg Agenda came out in 2023. So it was after I left, but I think it really reflected an ethos that we, throughout the Biden administration, that we brought to bringing more transparency and particularly more input from the public into the regulatory system. So specifically with the Reg Agenda, what the Biden administration ended up doing was to push the agencies and hold them accountable for giving the public more opportunities to weigh in on the Reg Agenda. So it's sort of commonly thought the way that the public engages with the regulatory system most traditionally is through notice and comment rulemaking. But that's so downstream, right? If you think about that, then that's the public entering the process right before everything is finalized. We thought it was really important to get input, not just at the end, like, have we dotted the i's and crossed the t's the right way? But what are the priorities? Because that's what the reg agenda is. It is an expression of priorities. And so Ricky Revesz, who ended up being the OIRA administrator when the document finally came out, you can see in that guidance agencies being told to engage in more public participation while they are assembling the reg agenda. So the public gets to say, you know what, we really think it's important that you do this, less important that you do that. And then to share that engagement through the regulatory agenda. So this extent of engagement, the opportunity for engagement needs to be reflected in the agency's submissions for the reg agenda. And even when they are describing, if you look at the reg agenda, there's what they call the little abstract, which tells you, the agency says to the public, okay, this is what we have on deck. This is what we think we're going to be doing. In those abstracts, the agencies are encouraged to actually reflect how they took in public engagement and how that affected what they have decided to do. So it sounds like small tweaks, but it's really taking a document that had almost no public voice in it and putting that public voice front and center. So I think that it was just really great updates. Unfortunately, I think that the Trump administration has withdrawn all of that guidance and all of that direction. I guess they don't want the public to have a say in what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, and to your point, like it makes sense to get the public involved early because, once you get to notice and comment, if folks have ever done that, that's where things get very technical, where it's scientific studies, legal analyses, the kinds of things that ordinary members of the public won't have a lot to contribute on. So it really does make sense to get them plugged in early, right?
If I can add one other thing, the other thing that this early involvement, this priority, this engagement around priority setting also addresses a problem that I think is one we really need to grapple with, which the APA doesn't grapple with, but I think we're going to go on to talk about petitions. It's why that idea is so important, is it addresses the problem of doing nothing, which notice and comment doesn't really do anything about the problem of agencies doing nothing. And there's a cost to doing nothing. And the structure, the law as it exists, doesn't really give the public a chance to weigh in on those costs that they often bear of an agency not fulfilling its statutory responsibilities. But in this priority setting phase, that's where the public can actually say, wait, I don't see this on the reg agenda. It should be there. Please put it on there.
Very helpful. And that does set up the next topic I want to discuss, which is the regulatory, the rulemaking petitioning process. So Dan, Administrative Procedure Act, this is the general statute that governs most aspects of how agencies implement the law through rulemakings and such. It includes this process where members of the public can petition agencies, ask agencies to initiate new rulemakings. Can you describe this petitioning process a little?
Yeah, sure, James. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and to have a chance to discuss one of my hobby horses, which is petitioning in the administrative state. So always a fun topic and a really timely one. So I think the kind of segue from what we've just been talking about should be pretty clear. Generally speaking, agencies make agendas and people take the agenda that agencies set. That's generally the way that the unified agenda is populated, is by agencies deciding to do something kind of sua sponte, of their own volition. But it turns out that there are some mechanisms for making agendas, forcing agendas on agencies, and the public enjoys these rights. And it's worth mentioning that this is actually not just in the APA, it's in the Constitution itself. The First Amendment contains a petition right, which was recognized by constitutional scholars as essential to the idea of popular sovereignty and a Republican form of government. Akhil Amar, a constitutional law professor at Yale Law School, even suggests that if a majority of Americans ever exercise their petition rights under the First Amendment for a constitutional convention, the government would actually be obliged to do so as a constitutional matter. So this, according to constitutional law scholars, has some real legal bite. And also, historically, this constitutional right to petition has been very important to how Congress functioned. We know that because of work by Maggie Blackhawk and Dan Carpenter, who showed that petitioning was very important in the early years of the Republic and in the anti-slavery movement. But critically, the kind of case law around the First Amendment petition rights suggests that the right doesn't entail any duty of the government to respond to petitions. And that's really where the APA is a bit different and arguably has more teeth. So Section 553E of the APA says that each agency shall give an interested person the right to petition for the issuance, amendment, or repeal of a rule. There are some statutes and regulations that supplement this or replace it, sometimes with more detail about what goes into a petition, how agencies should evaluate them, etc. But as a general matter, there's a general petition right under the APA in that Section 553E. It's worth noting that in the absence of any specific statute that layers on additional requirements for agencies in their processing of petitions, agencies do generally have wide discretion for how they take petitions and how they process them. So the details of how the petitions are supposed to be filed can very much vary across agencies. So it's always worth kind of contextualizing things and doing some research before you go ahead and try to submit a petition. And we'll talk more about that later, I'm sure. But some things are common. So Section 555B of the APA requires agencies that receive petitions to conclude a matter presented to the agency with due regard for the convenience and necessity of the parties or the representatives and within a reasonable time. And that has been interpreted as extending to petitions. So there is a duty to respond in a reasonable amount of time. And if an agency fails to live up to that duty, you can actually then go ahead and bring suit under Section 706(1) for unreasonable delay, and there are a variety of tests that courts deploy to figure out when a delay is unreasonable. But theoretically, if an agency just ignores your petition, you can sue them for that. Also, case law makes clear that agencies have a duty to provide some kind of reasoned response that engages with the merits of the petition if they're going to deny the petition. So while courts do sometimes credit reasons for denials that sound in resource allocation concerns, things like we just don't feel like doing it right now, the Supreme Court has made it reasonably clear somewhat recently, in a case I'll talk about a little bit later, that this shouldn't be enough by itself. Really, the agency has to deal with the merits of the petition, whether that's an argument that the agency should exercise some policy discretion, or whether the agency is obliged to act by the best interpretation of a statute. So when the petition raises those issues, the agencies have to deal with those issues and provide some kind of reasoned response if they want to go ahead and deny. It's important to note, finally, that there were some really important reforms in the Biden administration, spearheaded by Ricky Rivez and OIRA, to modernize petition docketing across agencies. It's not clear to me how far agencies got in this process before the transition, but in some cases, agencies may have developed more advanced systems and protocols, which I think should make this a more attractive procedural mechanism for public interest groups to utilize to try to shape agendas. So that's something to try to take a look at to see how much progress is actually made before the transition. So yeah.
Really helpful. So what we've heard is that administrative law is very good at providing folks with mechanisms to stop things, not so great at providing folks with mechanisms to start things. So there's this fundamental asymmetry, and rulemaking petitions is pretty good for what we've got. So can you talk a bit about how these have worked in the past? do these generally succeed? If have there been any notable examples of successful rulemaking petitions in the past that you can point to?
Yeah, so I've done some empirical research looking at a handful of agencies and gathering data where I could. Again, the records haven't been all that clear until this, reform in the Biden administration about docketing, and that was part of the impetus for the policy changes in the Biden administration to try to systemize some of that. So I did do some, deep dive research into how agencies were processing petitions across 3 agencies, and I found a grant rate of about 21%, which is not all that high, but it's not nothing either. So, sizable fraction of cases, agencies were persuaded to go ahead and grant petitions. A lot of those granted petitions are pretty incremental, I have to admit, at least the ones I looked at. But occasionally, some high profile petitions do get granted or at least litigated and then granted by order of the court. And the most high profile example of that is a case that many of you are probably familiar with, Massachusetts versus EPA. So in that case, there was a petition filed, I think, by a bunch of states, maybe some public interest groups as well. To ask EPA to regulate tailpipe emissions of greenhouse gases. That petition was ignored for a while. Then eventually it was denied by EPA, and that was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held that EPA erred in denying that petition. It departed from the reasons that were acceptable under the Clean Air Act for denying a petition along those lines. So basically, at the end of the day, that was how we got a lot of our climate regulations from EPA over the course of the last, 10 to 15 years. It all started with a petition that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was granted or ordered to be granted by the Supreme Court. There have also been some other high-profile battles in recent years. One that I've followed pretty closely is a battle over EPA's non-regulation of the pesticide chlorpyrifos. But if you start to dive into the world of petitioning, you find that there are some pretty high-profile petitions that, at a minimum, end up in pretty extensive litigation. They don't always end up with a grant of a petition or a court order to an agency to take action on a petition, but obviously, these are important battles nonetheless. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind with petitions more generally. Success is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. Success might just mean, mobilizing a constituency to advocate for further change outside the agency, or making the agency look bad for denying a petition, or lots of other things. A hostile administration like the current one, it might just be about slowing down agencies and distracting them from the work that they want to do with the work that you want them to do. So it's not actually all about changing the rules at the end of the day or getting a grant on a petition, although it's a really nice side benefit when they do. So I think it's worth kind of taking a more holistic perspective about petitions when we think about what success really means.
Very helpful. Well, I'm persuaded. Let's do some rulemaking petitions. But how do we do them? What would you recommend that folks include in their rulemaking petitions?
So I think a kind of general rule of thumb is that, you should treat them a lot like you treat comments in the notice and comment process. So petitions are going to be most effective where they contain sufficient information and support for the arguments that they make. And they shouldn't be a simple request without anything more. Just like a comment shouldn't just be a bare bones statement of a position or something like that. So they should include supporting studies, detailed descriptions of regulatory language that you want an agency to adopt, and things like that. So a pretty extensive overview of the position that you're advocating for. Ideally, they should read like the best comments do, as sort of legal or policy briefs that just happen to be appended to a specific ask of the agency. And I think post Loper Bright especially, it's good to spend significant time up front on legal interpretation in petitions. So, interpreting the statute and arguing that properly interpreted, it requires this rule, this change to existing regulations because the best meaning of the statute doesn't permit the status quo to go on. So I think, post Loper Bright, it's important to make sure that this legal analysis is in there and clearly indicates what provisions of law are being interpreted, especially if the basis for the petition is the best reading of the law requires the requested action. I think some other important things to keep in mind as you draft petitions is the kind of problem of making sure that agencies are following up with you or that you can get status requests. Oftentimes, it's sort of a black box. You submit a petition and it might be ignored for weeks, months, or even years. So I think it's important to be proactive in petitions and to request periodic status updates in the petition itself, kind of set that standard early on. And then to utilize your informal contacts with agencies to make sure that the agency, is following up on those status updates, complying with any applicable deadlines or things like that. Finally, I think this goes to the work of Dan Carpenter, the scholar that I mentioned earlier, who did a lot of work on the constitutional petitioning process and the politics of that. I think circulating petitions for co-signing, building networks through petitioning, is an incredibly effective political device. This is really kind of the upshot of Dan Carpenter's work, is to show how this is how the anti-slavery movement kind of built a network that allowed it to eventually scale up and win on its issue. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you can't ignore the opportunity that is created by allowing people to co-sign, circulating similar ideas to like-minded people, and building a network around specific issues. That political work is independent of the legal effect of the petitions. And it goes to what I was saying earlier about how success is in the eye of the beholder. If you exercise the right to go around and get co-signatures on petitions, it seems much more powerful to an agency, and it also can be leveraged. Even if the agency denies your petition, you can sort of say, well, look at all of the people who signed on to this, who the agency is ignoring. So I think it's a good practice to not just submit individual petitions, but to build some network around it and to ensure that lots and lots of people are co-signing.
Very helpful. Sid, so let's get a handle on what it is we're wrestling with here, what we're responding to. The Trump administration has not issued its first regulatory agenda yet. The spring agenda tends to come out May, June. So that is to say any week now. What do you expect to see in that document?
Thanks, James. First, as the board chair of CPR, let me add my thanks to the people who joined the call or who were going to watch it later on video. To answer your question, there's simply no reason to suspect that it's going to be anything but highly deregulatory and probably out of Project 2025. But I think that's where petitions come in, because we can start to draw a contrast between, as Dan was saying, the deregulation and deconstruction of government and a positive agenda that's indicated by petitions. Even more so, as Dan suggests, if they're the result of a coalition and movement building. And I want to elaborate on this point that we can win by losing. You file the petition, and that's a news event. Every 6 months, you get an update, and they're not working on the petition. That's a news event. Here's what they should be doing positively, and they're not going to do any of that. If they turn it down, likewise, and then somebody will have to decide whether it's worthwhile suing over. And that's all offering by way of comparison what they ought to be working on as compared to what they are working on. And then to take Dan's point about that the Supreme Court requires the agency to have a reasoned response, it could be very interesting because generally what agencies say and what they can get away with in a reasoned response is we're really busy regulating. We've got all these other higher and better regulatory ways to protect the public. This time around, they're going to have to say we're really busy deregulating and deconstructing. If they put that in writing, then we can point to that as an admission. As I can talk about a little bit later, this is much more contextual. It's very specific. It's around a specific proposal, and therefore it's not so abstract. Deconstructing the government, what is that? Refusing to take the next step in cleaning up the air or protecting the food, that is really very specific as opposed to what they're doing.
Really helpful. So, I mean, we've heard from Dan already a bit about how, you know, these things tend not to succeed. And he offered some thoughts about why they were still important to pursue anyways, even if you lose in the court of law. Do you have any other thoughts about why these could be so important, particularly now in the face of an administration that's trying to tear down the regulatory system, exclude the public from participation, and so forth?
I do, and it's really to expand maybe on what I just suggested. So there's no doubt, I think, for many of us that the president's efforts to unilaterally and preemptively dismantle the government is both unprecedented and it's created a constitutional crisis. But those are very vague words. And for those of us who keep up on this stuff, the relationship of government programs, administrative law, constitutional demands, it's like secondhand. And likewise for some citizens. But there's just many other people who, for understandable reasons, are a little less interested than we are. And they certainly don't therefore devote much time in keeping up. So this is all rather abstract. What does it mean to deconstruct the government? And one of CPR's goals has always been what we call connect the dots, to try to explain these more abstract concepts in administrative law and regulatory protection in terms of how they impact the lives of individuals and their aspirations for their families, for their communities, for their country. As I was just saying a moment ago, I think rulemaking petitions serve to explain what's going on in a specific context about not regulating, deconstructing, not doing anything. And because it can be pointed to petitions saying we have to take the next step to end the childhood epidemic of asthma in urban cities because of air pollution. A step that we need to protect your bank account by taking the following actions to make sure that banks don't take advantage of us. A petition that says we need more renewable energy and here's what you can do to cause that. That's the very time that they're shutting down renewable energy. And the petition says this is a cheaper way of achieving our objectives. It's going to mean less cost for American consumers of energy. Those are really specific kinds of ways of putting this in context. And I think that's the role if the public interest movement can find enough bandwidth to do that. And I realize that'll be a challenge. But a series of these petitions really is something we keep coming back to. And unfortunately, we have 3.5 years to do that. This is a strategy that I think could pay benefits. And as you said at the top, it's a way of going on offense at a time that we're all playing defense. I know there's a lot to do, but the whole goal of shock and awe was to prevent us, destabilize us, prevent any kind of action because we got too much to catch up with. And I hope we don't fall completely to prey at that. I think coming up with a petition campaign is a way of putting ourselves back in control.
James, can I add something to why I think like the petition process in this particular, I mean, I think it's always really important, but in this particular moment, and this administration has signaled that they plan to cut the public out of the regulatory, or in what will probably be their agenda, the deregulatory process, by eliminating or avoiding notice and comment to a large extent. And I worry sometimes that they will sort of use that to say, well, look, we cut the public out, nobody really cared. I mean, one way to show for the public to have shown sort of normal circumstances, you know, how they feel about what the appropriate role for the government is to comment, is to say, no, don't do that thing that you're proposing. And now, you know, they're trying to cut the public out of being able to do that. Petitions are a way of whatever position is taken to show that the public is watching and cares. And so that's, again, coming back to what Dan said before about like comments that come from broad coalitions that have lots of people's names on it, I think sends a really important message that the public is watching, they do care, and they do want to participate, and that will create a real contrast and really push back on this narrative that I think by taking the public out of notice and comment, that this administration is putting forward, that this isn't for the public. We don't care what the public has to say.
And, you know, this notion of essentially building our own people's regulatory agenda also in that same way signals what our priorities are as a public, right? So when the administration rejects these petitions and says, hey, these are how we're going to protect people, this is what we think is the best way to do it, that can undercut that argument, right? Like, hey, no, that's not what the public asked for. That's not what you're elected to do. This is what the public wants. So why aren't you doing this stuff over here? Any other thoughts before we move on? All right.
This may be your next question. I don't know. But I thought I'd say a word about our project that is CPR's project called the People's Agenda. People's OMB. We got this idea, and I think it ties in with petitions, and I think it's important along the lines that Sharon was just talking about. The idea here is it's consciously modeled on parliamentary systems where the party out of power presents a shadow government, and that shadow government does its own agenda. To contrast it with what the government in power is doing and says, no, those guys are doing that, but if we were in power, we'd be doing something better, and here it is. And I think this is our opportunity again to make a positive statement of what's needed over the next 3 years that contrasts very starkly, probably, with their vision of America, which is relentlessly libertarian and authoritarian, as Sharon was just pointing out, because they don't want to include people in it. We see the possibility of building the People's Agenda, the People's OMB, just in the way that was just suggested from the bottom up, from suggestions from groups like those on call and others. And every time they come up with their semi-annual regulatory agenda, we're hoping we can publish our People's Agenda as a contrast and explanation of what government should be doing and can do to protect people and the environment. And given that these folks are so extreme, that contrast I think is very important to make. And again, it's specific. It doesn't talk about deregulation. It doesn't even talk about the lack of public input, if that's kind of meaningless. It says, here's the next 20 things the government needs to do specifically. And that's going to make sense to people because it can and will be related, because it does relate to what people need to nourish their families, have a good job, make a good life for themselves, and have a good country.
Really helpful. Thank you. Before we turn things over to audience Q&A, I wanted to see if any of you had thoughts about whether there was any potential risks or drawbacks from pursuing this strategy and what we could do to mitigate those.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to this a little bit. I mean, I think that there are a lot of uh, unknowns around petitioning, in part because it hasn't actually been a central part of regulatory practice for a long time, and people have overlooked the petitioning process. So, what does a world look like when, petitioning becomes very, central to the progressive movement? Well, we might expect that there would be some eventual co-optation of some sort of the tools of petitioning by, opposing interests. So, I think a lot about the risks of weaponization by anti-regulatory interests once you show that this can be done. It's ultimately a procedurally neutral tool that could either further people's agenda control, or potentially boost the interests of deregulatory interests. So I think that's one risk that needs to be thought through. Is this sort of like the nuclear bomb of administrative law, and we're better off not really opening that can of worms. I think another thing is more traditionally a concern for people, and this was actually a big part of why courts traditionally have deferentially reviewed petitions that are denied by agencies, is the risks of harassment and suboptimal agenda setting. So there's a lot of concern in the literature and in the case law about agencies being harassed in various ways. In some of my research on petitions, I found some petitions to Fish and Wildlife Service to list Sasquatch and Homo sapiens as endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. Frivolous petitions that just kind of waste everybody's time, right? Although maybe there's a point to be made about Homo sapiens, I don't know. Also on the suboptimal agenda setting thing, there was a lot of literature out there around the experience at the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which really robustly embraced petitioning and had a very elaborate set of rights and duties to respond. Arguably, the CPSC kind of got caught up in a lot of proceedings that maybe weren't the most important regulatory proceedings because they just happened to be the ones that were petitioned on. So a lot of the literature raises this concern that petitions, if we really leverage them too much, or put too much stock in them, could lead agencies down the wrong path and lead them to ignore bigger problems that they should really be spending more of their time on. So that's an argument in favor of discretion on the part of agencies to figure out, when they want to allocate resources to particular issues. I think it's worth noting that that kind of take on the CPSC has been pushed back on a bit by scholars like Barry Brosi and Eric Bieber in the context of Endangered Species Act petitions. They show that in that context, at least, the petitions that are submitted by public interest groups are actually identifying pretty important issues, just as important, if not more important, than the ones that are flagged by the agency itself using its own resources. So there's a bit of a debate out there about, whether agencies really need to have a lot of discretion in figuring out, what are the issues that we should really be focusing on, versus, the ability of people to kind of crowdsource some of the important issues that agencies should be focusing on but aren't. The last thing I would say as a risk is the risk of lock-in of interpretations of law, and particularly in the Loper-Bright regime. We're now in a world, it's very different from the world we were in before with Chevron deference, where agencies had a lot of discretion. Now we're told that, statutes have a single best meaning, and courts are supposed to enforce that against agencies' preferences. So there is a risk that, especially during the Trump administration and in this world of Loper-Bright, if you successfully petition an agency to undertake a rulemaking, and then in the context of that rulemaking, it takes a position that is suboptimal, that, isn't, very good in the long run, that gets locked in either by the agency taking that position and then writing it into law as a rule, or as a court coming on after the fact in litigation and saying, yes, this is in fact the single best interpretation of the statute that the agency is implementing, or maybe disagreeing with the agency, but saying, here's what we really think the best meaning of the statute is, and it's something that's very bad. So I think that there are those kinds of risks. It's not to say that they're, aren't countervailing benefits. I think we've heard from Sharon and Sid about some of those benefits. And I think this is just a question that you have to think through. Are these risks kind of worth the rewards?
I don't know, Dan. We Homo sapiens may be endangered these days. Let me add I don't know if it's a risk, but a reality, which is the petitions process is most successful to the extent it's successful at all regarding rulemaking and rules. It has really no bite concerning lack of enforcement, where the courts protect the discretion of agencies. And a lot of the deregulation which occurred in the first 4 years of the Trump administration was simply they didn't enforce any laws. And I think we can expect that again. So they've been largely unsuccessful in deregulating because the deregulations have always gone too far and are illegal. But that didn't mean there was any law. That doesn't mean we won, but because we also got 4 years of very limited enforcement. And petitions probably can't do much in that area.
And of course, they've signaled with their executive order that they're going to actually, I mean, they've just said the quiet part out loud. They are not going to enforce who knows how many regulations as a result of whatever this review is that they're doing of their perception of the application of Loper Bright major questions doctrine, that whole suite of doctrine. So yeah, totally agree. We're going to see the enforcement problem is just a different problem we're going to have to figure out a different way to address.
And Dan, you in your response, you partially addressed one of the questions we got from the audience, which is, what if the administration calls her bluff and actually takes up a petition and issues a really bad rule? I mean, there's ways to fight back against that, but you're absolutely right. There's in a post-Loper Bright era, there's also that risk of statutory interpretation lock-in. So maybe something you just an analysis you perform prior to submitting a petition is, what is the Loper Bright risk of going down this road? Is there any, and how can we avert it? Okay, so great conversation so far. Why don't we reward the audience with some Q&A? First up, we have somebody asking about the Trump administration. So what we're basically talking about here is democratizing the rulemaking process. Shouldn't be controversial, but somehow it is. Trump administration is doing just the opposite. Have all of you been tracking this and have anything to say about the different ways the Trump administration has been trying to cut out the public from the rulemaking process?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I think I raised this before. It's just, I don't know that I can still find myself surprised by some of the actions of this administration, but repeatedly they have issued memorandums or executive orders where they set forth their prospective deregulatory agenda and just express that they are going to avoid the notice and comment process, which is, the de-democratization, even the little bit of democracy that the APA sort of injects into the rulemaking process, they are doing away with that. So we have, what I think will be coming out soon is the list of regulations that they believe should not be enforced or need to be taken out of CFR because of their perception that they are not consistent with Loper Bright, major questions doctrine, Jarchese, whatever. I think there are about 10 decisions. And in the memorandum or the fact sheet where they spell out their perception of what those 10 decisions do, I would just note for folks that there's some really gross mischaracterizations of those decisions, which is a real problem. I mean, it's an obvious problem. If you're not going to have notice and comment, nobody else is going to get to tell them. I mean, until you're in litigation, that they have room, they've rescinded those rules based on an incorrect legal interpretation of the cases. That's one category. But then we've also seen at the State Department and at HHS, again, these very broad sweeping statements of saying, areas where I think through Democratic and Republican administrations, there's been an understanding that the APA applies and requires notice and comment rulemaking, or on the HHS side that that there's been a commitment to notice and comment without pushing the legal question of whether it is actually compelled or not, that they are just going to change course and do something different than any Democratic or Republican administration has done, and not subject things like immigration regulations to notice and comment. So this is really, really a sweeping removal of the public from I think, unprecedentedly deregulatory agenda. So those two things together are highly, highly troubling.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that I think they're universally troubling. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of commentary from center right folks about being troubled with some of these changes to notice and comment. Susan Dudley has an op-ed, I think, today, or a short write-up on it. And I've seen other comments from more right of center or centrist administrative law scholars kind of saying the same thing. So I think there's blood in the water on this issue, and I cannot underscore the brilliant thing that Sharon said earlier about creating kind of a shadow comment process here. Really, the Trump administration can't strip notice and comment, because petitions are always there, agencies always have to take them, and they always have to respond to them. So it is really just incumbent on the public interest community to create its own shadow notice and comment process, and then turn around as Sid suggested, and say, to the extent that the agency ignores these petitions, it's just, more evidence of their, kind of misguided approach to public participation more generally.
One reason we're seeing that comments from sort of across the political spectrum in administrative law is one goal of administrative law is accountability. And I suppose, ironically, but on a different level, the Trump administration is all about the unrepresentative deep state and its unaccountability. And in fact, that's what they're doing. It doesn't exist until they made it exist.
But there has been one notable exception to all of this. One spot where the Trump administration has actually increased public participation, and that's if you zoom over to regulations.gov, they have this form there where you can submit your deregulatory suggestions.
That's true.
Click through that form, everyone, if you get a chance, and then read the questions. And nobody who is not like an industry lobbyist could reasonably fill that out, right? I mean, for one thing, they've already sort of stacked the deck because they only want deregulatory suggestions. But even to play the game that they've sort of created, you have to have this just incredible level of sophistication, right? So, I mean, how they actually pursue public participation, such as it is very revealing in and of itself.
And then James,
Oh,
sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Sharon,
If I could add on that, like the idea that kind of process could be a substitute for what the APA requires. I don't know if they're going to say that, but it would be patently ridiculous because, of course, one feature of administrative law, when done properly, is that agencies have to respond to significant comments. Now, if they're creating this other sort of lesser process for commenting, I don't know how they're going to square that, but I assume that they are not going to be meticulous, as the law would otherwise require, about responding to any comments that come in through this other pathway. So it is truly not a substitute for notice and comment, and nobody should be misled otherwise.
Ben?
I was just going to add something to the point you made, James, about the kind of the inside baseball process that's been set up for industry lobbyists and the like through that portal. I mean, this is a challenge with petitions, is sort of knowing where the opportunities are and having the expertise to give agencies really credible ideas and specific ideas for good regulations. And one thought that occurred to me is that there's, unfortunately, a lot of people who are leaving the government after long careers right now who would be great sources of information about the things that were on their wish list for a long time to do, but couldn't, work it through, administrative channels for whatever reason. Those are the kind of people to be talking to right now and to be working with to try to populate this people's regulatory agenda. There's a lot of expertise there, and not just sort of policy expertise, but also institutional expertise. So I think definitely a worthwhile resource to consult.
That's such a great idea, Dan. I just wrote it down. That's why it disappeared from the camera.
Do we have time?
Yeah, go. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. To show a little more about small d democracy in notice and comment rulemaking, Professor Elizabeth Fisher and I are in the middle of an extensive study of reading rulemaking comments. And a lot of them are technical and legal. But there's also huge participation by the public because it's now electronic. And there are many people who file sort of irrelevant comments, but there are as many useful comments when people tell stories and provide contextual and specific information about their lives that's relevant to the rulemaking process. With electronic rulemaking, it really has moved closer to hearing from people, not only lobbyists and lawyers, but just everyday people who are concerned or interested in a rule.
So Sid, in my administrative law class, I have my students once a semester, they have to go find a rule that's open and find an individual comment, not a robo comment, not a professional comment. And then we share them in class, and it is so heartwarming. We've had things from like 8-year-old children weighing in to people who, are really experts through some hobby that they have that's going to be affected by a rule. It's a really heartening thing to do, to spend a little time, find something that sparks your interest, and then just go in and see how the public responds, and that they take the time out of their busy days to actually engage. It's a great exercise.
Well, I now have an activity idea for my 8-year-old. We are running up against time, and I wanted to make sure we tied up some things with a bow. There was a quick question in the audience about, can we anticipate when the reg agenda comes out in advance? Generally, no. That's like something that's like a closely guarded secret that's dropped out of nowhere. And you sort of get towards May, and then you like hit refresh on reginfo.gov every morning if you're a nerd. So yeah, so the short answer is no. But I would say keep an eye on reginfo.gov starting in the next week or so. So yeah, this is all building up towards us proposing that we as a advocacy community come together and start building a people's regulatory agenda, that we start leveraging this tool of rulemaking petitions. And there was a lot of questions and suggestions in the Q&A box, some suggestions for specific petitions, some folks wondering how they could engage even though they're small shops. I want to say we're trying to help. The point of this is we want to help you guys take advantage of this. So we will be sending out an email soon after this that includes the recording and our standard survey. Please fill it out. We'd like to know how we're doing. But it will also include 2 forms. One is a form where you can make suggestions for recommendations for our regulatory agenda. It is a good form, not a bad form like the Trump administration's. It's meant for everybody. Very simple. And there's also a form for suggestions for rulemaking petitions. Again, very simple, meant to be available and accessible to everyone. So keep an eye out for that. We will also be hosting a library of resources. Oh, and the forms are right there. You don't even have to wait. We will also be hosting a library of resources on our website with some additional useful information for doing petitions if, let's say, you're feeling particularly sophisticated and want to try it on your own. So please keep an eye out for all that stuff. I want to once again, we really nailed the timing on this. I want to once again thank the panelists for joining us today and sharing their expertise. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and giving this, strange topic a good listening. And I look forward to working with all of you on this very, very important project. Thank you.